Peon, Croyd, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. I briefly touched on this last week. My dear mother, who has been kind enough to watch all these videos on a series of books that she's never read and listen to her son rant about these books. She pointed out a lot of times when I get to a certain book in the series, I have a familiar refrain, which is that this one is one of my favorites. And she said, well, they can't all be your favorites, right? Which is true, but I feel like, well, there are 30 books, so it occurred to me, okay, I should just do a video listing my top 10, because surely any book that's in my top 10, I'd be perfectly justified in saying it's one of my favorites. But that does mean that mathematically that means one in every 3 books that I talk about is going to be something where I say this is one of my favorites. But I mean, why would I be doing a video about a series of books where I dislike most of them? But I'm just gonna only list my top 10, and the rule will be that now any book that's not in this list going forward, I'm not allowed to say that it's one of my favorites. So starting at number 10 and counting down. So number 10, I picked Low Chicago, which I haven't actually gotten to. We'll get to it soon. It's volume 25 in the Wildcards chronology. So some of these on the list are ones I haven't gotten to in too much depth yet, but Low Chicago. So 2 things about this one. It's set in Chicago. It's the only Wildcards book where it's all set in Chicago, which I'm in Milwaukee, so not exactly the same city, but it's as close to my hometown as Wildcards is probably going to get, so I appreciate that. It also is a time travel book, and fans of Wildcards know that time travel as a story device was kind of banned by George R.R. Martin, just because there's already so many characters and storylines to keep track of with all these different authors contributing their own individual stories and characters, that to try and keep track of any kind of like multiple timelines and time travel stuff would just be a step too far. There's already enough to track that time travel would break the camel's back. But he lifted the ban for one book. He was like, for one book and one book only, we'll do time travel, and that's Low Chicago. So not only do you get a book set in Chicago, but you actually get a book set in different eras of Chicago, and they're able to touch on sort of famous moments in history. I told a friend of mine who hails from Chicago about this book, about that premise, and she was able to guess. Like, she was like, okay, so let me guess, there's a story with Al Capone in the 20s, and I was like, yes, that's right. She was like, let me guess, there's an H.H. Holmes story? I was like, yes, indeed. She's like, The Great Fire? It's like, yep. I never thought Wildcards needed a time travel story, but now that there is one, I have to say I quite enjoy it. There's a lot of fun stuff, and I'll get into detail when I actually get to Low Chicago. But it's a time travel story set in Chicago, so it's on the top 10 list. One of my favorites. Number 9 is Black Trump, which I already talked about. Just a cool globe-trotting adventure that features 2 of my favorite characters as leads, Jay Aykroyd, as written by George R.R. Martin, and Mark Meadows, as written by Vic Milan. I mentioned before that the Card Sharks triad is my favorite overall triad of Wildcards. 13, 14, and 15, I think, just comprise the most satisfying trilogy, and Black Trump is the climax to that trilogy. Just this very sprawling adventure story that I really love. Number 8. Turn of the Cards, another one I talked about. Every other Wildcards book has multiple authors. There are 3 that just have a single author. And this one is by Vic Milan, who I've mentioned before is my favorite Wildcards author, and he's created Mark Meadows, who's my favorite Wildcards character. And I think a lot of that is because of this book, because this book makes Mark Meadows, it's his solo novel, and Mark Meadows himself is a whole cast of characters, because he takes these different potions and becomes different personae. So he really is a cast of characters all on his own, and so to give him his own novel was a brilliant idea, and I think Vic Milan just rises to the challenge. Great showcase, novel-length showcase for my favorite character in Wildcards, and one who I think really deserved a showcase of that scope. Number 7, Knaves Over Queens. Haven't gotten to it yet in the chronological review because it's volume 27. I've said to people that I consider myself kind of a Anglophile dilettante. I would never proclaim myself to be an expert on all things English, but I just overall just sort of the vibe of all things English has always attracted me. Black Trump, which is already on my list. One of the things I mentioned about how much I love about Black Trump is that they introduced this branch of British intelligence, MI7, I believe, which is the Order of the Silver Helix, the wild card branch of military intelligence. Combination of like that kind of James Bond espionage stuff that I love, and wild cards, which I love. As soon as they introduced it in Black Trump, I was like, oh man, I want to see more of this. In the era of the Tor relaunch, the wild cards authors have been very obliging. The Order of the Silver Helix is very much a large presence in a lot of the Tor books. But in Knaves Over Queens, the premise of Knaves Over Queens is that it's an anthology. It's all set in England, Ireland, Scotland. Even when they announced it, I remember thinking, they made this one just for me. This is what I've always wanted, is Wild Cards England. The other part of it was Aces Abroad, which is where they take the tour of different countries and look at how the wild card virus has affected different countries. I remember reading that whole book and thinking, I can't wait till they get to London, England, because I know that, because they lay out the itinerary early in the book, and like one of the last stops is London. And it's like, oh, I can't wait till they get to London. I want to see that. And then when they actually get to London, it's like a 10-page story, and it's not actually about anything British. There's nothing British in it at all, other than they might mention that Big Ben is in the background or something. But apart from that, Black Trump kind of rectified it, because they have a lot of scenes set in England and Ireland. Winston Churchill, who's 120 years old at that point in the Wild Cards universe, and then Knaves Over Queens really finally is a full feast, and it really everything I could have wanted. And again, I'll talk more about it when I get to that video. I'm looking forward to it. But like I say, as soon as they announced the premise, I was like, oh man, I can't wait for this one, and was not disappointed at all. Expectations were met and or exceeded with every story. Number 6, Inside Straight. It's the first book of the Tor relaunch. Anthology of short stories by different authors, but one of the more novelistic anthologies in the Wild Cards world. The authors are really working tightly together. I mentioned in my video for that one that it feels like the authors are really expertly deployed, perfectly utilized in that one. It just feels so tailored to each author's strengths. And it's a brand new cast of characters. I mean, so many characters in Inside Straight are new because they really wanted the Tor relaunch to feel like kind of like Wild Cards the next generation. You know, the first 15 books were Kirk and Spock, and now this is like Wild Card. This is the Wild Cards, Wild P-Cards. There's a lot of new things that for an old fan like me, I was maybe even a little dubious about going in. Like, you know, I know it goes in real time, so a lot of my favorite characters would be really old by now. So of course they have to rejuvenate it with new blood and new authors. But I was maybe a little skeptical. Like, I don't know. But yeah, once I read it, was like, oh man, I'm so on board. Number 5, Fort Freak, which I just did 2 videos on that one, so that one's pretty fresh. Anyone watching these videos in order, like my mom, you've already heard me rave about Fort Freak in 2 videos, so I don't need to get too in-depth on this one, but I love it. Number 4, Card Sharks. I already mentioned, the Card Sharks triad is my favorite triad. Black Trump is the rousing climax to that triad, but Card Sharks is the opening volley. Just creating this incredibly awesome tone, this sense of like sinister forces at work, this anti-Wild Cards conspiracy through these stories that are set in different decades, different eras. You know, Wild Cards is always great when they do that. That's why a lot of the books on my list do that. You know, like I said, Low Chicago, obviously time travel, the whole point there is to be set in different eras. Knaves Over Queens starts in the 1940s and kind of moves chronologically through the decades. And so Knaves Over Queens and Low Chicago, haven't done either of those yet, so I can get more in depth there. We'll save that. But Card Sharks is another one where they show the conspiracies, different operations and different triumphs over the decades. So you get the Card Sharks trying to burn down Jokertown in the 50s and being involved in the assassinations of both Kennedy brothers in the 60s and the Iranian hostage crisis in 1980. Just a great longitudinal survey, chronological survey of the 20th century as seen through the Wild Cards lens, but also given focus by this overarching evil conspiracy. Number 3, Aces High. It's a book about an alien invasion. As I told a friend once when I was reading the book, and she was asking me about it, she was like, what is it about? And I was like, superheroes versus aliens. It's very deep. Not a deep book, but just a very, just beautifully constructed book. It feels very nicely interconnected. The stories, the authors all feel like they're working in a very perfect tandem to really take you through this, what is a very corny premise when you boil it down to one sentence, but to give it all these different facets and complications and intrigues that sort of wind and twist and overlap and intersect, and ends up being an incredibly rewarding experience. Card Sharks at number 4 and Aces High at number 3. I think they're both rank so high for me because they both have really fantastic final lines. Low Chicago has a pretty good final line too, but Card Sharks just has such a memorable, chilling final line, and Aces High has a very, very satisfying and very funny final line. And so it's always, I think, anytime a book can keep you interested right up to the last line and deliver a final line that really makes you smile and go, yeah, that always earns some extra points. So that probably accounts for Card Sharks and Aces High ranking so well in this list. So Aces High is at number 3. Final 2 books, rather than ranking them number 2 and number 1, I'm declaring that a tie for number 1. Ace in the Hole and Dead Man's Hand, 6 and 7. These are 2 books that I don't feel too badly about putting them next to each other and giving them a tie score, because they were in fact supposed to be one book. Originally, it was a mosaic novel set over 8 days in July of 1988 during a fictional version of the Democratic National Convention of 1988. 7 authors writing 8 characters, because Vic Milan does double duty and writes 2 characters. When it all was put together, it was something like a 700-page manuscript, or 650, somewhere between 650 and 700 pages, which nowadays, that's like maybe half of a Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones book. So the publisher wouldn't even blink. But back then, the publisher was like, we can't, it's not cost effective to do a 700-page book. So what they did was they took 2 of the narratives, the J. Ackroyd one and the Daniel Brennan one by George R. R. Martin and John Joseph Miller, respectively, and just made that its own book. So the other 5 authors with their 6 characters write about them for Ace in the Hole, Volume 6, but you're left with some kind of mysterious loose ends involving J. Ackroyd and Daniel Brennan and the murder of Chrysalis, and that's finally resolved in Volume 7, Dead Man's Hand. I think I probably said when I did the videos for those 2 that I actually like to read them kind of in tandem, like read a few pages of 6 and then read a few pages of 7, because they literally do take place simultaneously over those same 8 days in July during that Democratic National Convention. The books do read really well separate, but they also read very nicely and synergistically when you kind of are reading them simultaneously. They're this sort of weird kind of hybrid 2 books in 1 or 1 book in 2, depending how you look at it. Double powered super book. And so always and forever I have to keep those 2 as my number 1 pick for best Wildcards book or best 2 Wildcards books. The way they work on each one on their own and also work synergistically together is just such a cool kind of unique thing. And they're just 2 very interesting stories. Ace in the Hole is about this, political convention, and it's got this kind of Manchurian Candidate kind of feel. They even name dropped the Manchurian Candidate at one point as a kind of acknowledgement that it's kind of got that feel of this kind of political thriller, but with this kind of superhuman mind control element. Meanwhile, Dead Man's Hand, they separated out these 2 threads about solving this murder mystery in Jokertown, and by doing that, they created this very noirish thing that kind of stands alone, that the Democratic Convention stuff is this kind of, Manchurian Candidate political thriller thing, and then Dead Man's Hand ends up being solving this one murder in the seedy streets of Jokertown, and this private eye, gumshoe character slowly piecing it together. And then, like I say, when you read them in tandem and see how they're connected, and this one murder in Jokertown is actually connected to this whole political conspiracy. Just so cool. So there you go. So Mom, if I ever say that any other book besides these 10 is one of my favorites, you can call me a liar. But my favorite Wildcards books are Low Chicago, Black Trump, Turn of the Cards, Knaves Over Queens, Inside Straight, Fort Freak, Card Sharks, Aces High, Ace in the Hole, Dead Man's Hand. Feel free, fans, Wildcards fans. I always solicit comments, and I get a couple, which is nice. But I don't know, a video like this seems like it should be comment bait, right? Tell me my 10 choices are wrong. Tell me your 10 choices. Would love to hear that stuff. This is the stuff that discussions are born of. Yeah, Wildcards fans, unite. On that note, that'll be it for this one, and next week we'll get back to the chronological look. We'll look at Volume 22, Lowball, which I'm not allowed to say is one of my favorites because it's not one of my top 10. Until then.
So my honey and me go to a counselor to try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Card Sharks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.